Please be seated. The two sides hate one another. Decades of broken promises, duplicitous alliances, and endless conflict have built a level of mistrust unseen in the past. If you're not with us, you're against us, is the rallying cry. And choosing sides, well, that's become the thing to do. Despite changes in leaderships and attempts to bridge a compromise, the situation just keeps getting worse. One side feels they have been wronged by the other, and the feeling is quite mutual. There seems to be no way to stem the tide of rising animosity. Now, you might think I'm talking about the present, but I'm actually describing the world of more than a century ago. The year is 1914, and the world has become engulfed in war. Over the 4 years of hostilities, 17 million people will die, and another 20 million will be wounded. That's how I began my Christmas sermon this past year, using the story of the warring parties during World War I and their entrenched positions as a way of examining our world today. For we live in a world not unlike that one, where division and polarization are the order of the day. If you're not with us, you're against us is once again a rallying cry. And a no man's land has developed between two entrenched sides. Now, some on both sides look for ways to bridge that no man's land with compromise, but they're quickly dispatched by those who see this as an all-or-nothing world. We think of ourselves as Democrats or Republicans, and with that comes the idea that our way is 100% right and the other way is 100% wrong. But it need not be that way. The world does not need to be an either-or proposition, for, my brothers and sisters, there is always another way, a better way. Think about the time that Jesus was approached by a group of Pharisees and Herodians and asked if it were lawful to pay taxes to the emperor. Now, recognize at first that the Pharisees and the Herodians were enemies. They mistrusted one another, and they saw the world in two very different ways. For them to come together meant that they were more afraid of Jesus than they were of cooperating with one another. Well, why then did they come? To trip Jesus up. If he answered yes, well, he would be betraying the Jews and the Pharisees. And if he answered no, well, then he would be betraying the Herodians and the Romans. This was nothing but a political ploy to discredit a dangerous rabble-rouser. For while they disliked each other, they agreed on one thing. This Jesus was a threat to the status quo, and he was upsetting their either-or view of the world. And so they had to discredit him to prevent him from messing up their system. Their system worked fine for them, thank you very much. But Jesus, of course, thwarts their plans. For you see, in their entrenched worldview, they saw only two possible answers, theirs or the opponent's. They viewed the world as an either-or proposition, and so they were amazed when Jesus chooses neither answer, but instead finds a middle way. He asks whose face is on the coin used to pay the tax, and they tell him, well, Caesar's. Then give Caesar what is Caesar's, and give God what is God's. Jesus teaches them and us that the world is so much more than our limited perspectives can conceive. He shows us that there is always another way, a third way, a way that embraces love. What if we stopped identifying ourselves as members of a political party and instead embrace the notion that we are Christians? Well, of course, you're thinking it's perfectly okay for us to be both. And that sounds easy. But think for a moment about what that means. As Christians, we recognize that God is love. Each one of us is a child of God and is beloved in God's eye. So that means then that both the Antifa protester and the Klansman are children of God. Ouch. Suddenly it's a bit trickier to reconcile our Christianity with our political worldview. It's hard to demonize someone when we recognize them as a child of God. But my brothers and sisters, it is essential that we do. For while the world is about dividing us, God is about uniting. So, how do we actually do it? How do we love even those with whom we strongly disagree? The answer comes from Paul. In the letter to the Romans, Paul tells us, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Do not be conformed to this world. In other words, don't do what the world tells you to do. Don't let the world change who you are. Here's the same passage in a bit more modern translation. See if this works better for you. Take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best in you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Don't let the culture drag you down to its level, for God has given you more than the culture ever could. Don't get bogged down in binary either-or thinking, for that just keeps you beholden to the world and its culture. Don't allow the world's either-or thinking to drive you to hate those who don't agree with your views. For we're not people of hate, but people of love. No, my brothers and sisters, as Christians, we follow the example of Jesus, who rejected the paradigm set by the Pharisees and the Herodians and found a different path, a wiser path. Like Jesus, we have the opportunity to do the same. Now it starts with listening to one another. Really listening. Not listening to refute, not even listening to respond, but simply listening to hear someone else's perspective. Remember that each person you meet is a child of God. So their perspective matters, and they are worthy of your time and attention. And then, when you have heard them, respond in love. Give them your perspective, and if they too are listening, well, guess what? You've now begun a dialogue. Not an argument, but a conversation in which you may learn from one another. You might just find that the opinions that you held so tightly are not as strong as they once were. You may find that other perspectives can give you a different lens to see these issues with fresh eyes. If you can do that, if you can engage one another in a dialogue of real listening, well, then you just might find that third path, the path that leads to wisdom. And when we all do that, my brothers and sisters, when we all do that, we can indeed change the world.